This is very unusual for us because we cannot see any of the attendees. We can just see the other panelists, and I can see myself. But my name is Esther Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute, and I would like to welcome you all, even though I can't see you, to our new webinar series entitled Bring the Shrine Home. This is our very first webinar that we are doing at the Woolf Institute. So if there are any technical glitches or anything going slightly awry, please forgive us. We're sort of learning as we go along in this new virtual learning environment. For those of you who do not know the Woolf Institute, we are a research institution. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, with public education, and with policy work. And we focus mainly on the Abrahamic religions, so Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to foster understanding between people of different beliefs and improve the way that people live together in society. So in this set webinar series, we will discuss the challenges that faith communities face in the current crisis. How do we bring communal worship into our home? What are the problems and the opportunities in this new virtual world of worship? How about religious authority, for example, during virtual community worship? How about gender segregation that we usually have in particular places of worship, such as mosques and synagogues? So these are all topics that we want to discuss in this series. And today we want to focus on the festivals, because all faith communities will have to deal with upcoming festivals in April, as April brings the important festivals for all three Abrahamic religions. We have Passover, we have Easter, and we have Ramadan. And when the communities are in lockdown, when this very essence of the holidays are being taken away by the social distancing practices, what can the faithful do here? And here with us are today three panelists. We have Alissa Symon, who's the Jewish co-chaplain of Cambridge University, and she's really the brains behind this webinar series. She's brought it all about. And she's also, I'm very proud to say, she's a former MPhil student of the Woolf Institute and the University of Cambridge. Our second panelist is the Revd Devin McLachlan, who's an associate vicar at Great St. Mary's in Cambridge. And our third panelist is Mohammed, who is the CEO of MAUR, M-A-U-R, and an MPhil student of the Woolf Institute and the University of Cambridge. And we also have with us Tara Zamet, who will hopefully, she's our communications and digital media officer, and she will hopefully help us troubleshoot if any sort of technical difficulties arise. So to explain how it's going to work, we will begin with 3-minute presentations, with 7-minute presentations of each of the three speakers. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. We like to present topics in a very concise and accessible fashion at the Woolf Institute. So I have two little implements that help the speakers to jog along. It's a 2-minute sign when they have 2 minutes left, and a stop sign when they need to stop talking. And then afterwards for the Q&A, you will have on your screens an option to send any questions you would like to ask. And I will read them out then to the speakers and direct them to the relevant speaker. So since Passover was only 2 days away, we'll start with Alissa. Alissa Symon, please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Miriam, and thank you everybody for attending. This is really exciting to be preparing for the holidays in this interfaith webinar. So what I want to share with you is just a couple of thoughts about how the Jewish community has been preparing really for Passover this year in light of COVID-19. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what Passover is for people who don't know and what it means. So first, Passover celebrates the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. And in many ways, this is the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar, and level of observance throughout the Jewish world are really, really high. The climax of the holiday comes already on the first evening on the Seder. So in simple translation, the Seder means the order. And it's called the order because we have a very strict set of texts and prayers and ceremonial foods, which we kind of maintain throughout the evening. And it's all very kind of set along by law. So by and large, the essence of the holiday is discussing the meaning of the Exodus from Egypt. And on the evening of the Seders, which is happening tomorrow night, families congregate together and read religious texts and these prayers from the book called the Haggadah. And really the focus of the Seder is sharing the story of the redemption with the younger generation, so with the children and grandchildren that attend this event. So usually families assemble around the table, and grandparents or parents lead the evening, and they direct their questions at the younger generation to try and engage them. And every family has a really different sweet ways of doing this, whether it's through questions or quizzes or songs, and really the center is the children. So unfortunately this year, as obvious, it's not going to be, we're not going to be able to have this essence due to the lockdown and social distancing. So multiple generations won't be getting together. And so, for example, last year we celebrated the Seder. We were 21 people around the table. This year, my family is going to be separated in 5 different locations. And tomorrow night, it's just going to be my husband and myself around the Seder table. And the very essence of sharing the story between the generations is impossible. So the question is, what do we do? So I'm just going to share with you 2 things that have come up in the Jewish world and how really rabbis and leaders are coping with COVID-19. So the first thing is that we'll begin more with the Orthodox world. There's a really interesting phenomenon happening there. And that is that a few weeks ago, Sephardi rabbis issued a decree saying that older people, the grandparents and the older parents can use Zoom on the Seder evening so that they have a way to reach out to the younger generations to keep the essence of Passover, to keep the essence of the Seder. And this is an unprecedented leniency because in general, the use of electricity is prohibited on the Sabbath and on the festivals. But the rabbis felt that this year, really, we need to use this unprecedented measure in order to keep the essence of the holiday. But in reaction to this ruling, obviously this now becomes a political issue. Many Ashkenazi rabbis, and this includes the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the chief rabbinate in Israel, countered and said that the use of modern technology is completely forbidden and this should not be done, and it's, we'll find a different way to maintain the essence of Passover. And I think that what is really interesting about this is that we see usually the fight between the Ashkenazi and Sfardis. We don't see it every day. The fact that there are different rulings, different halachic ways of interpreting text, it's not felt. But in this crisis, we're seeing the divide again between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi Jews kind of resurface. And it's maybe a little bit sad that in a time that is so hectic for everybody, we're also seeing tensions rise within the Jewish communities. And I think maybe that's a little bit sad. But maybe another optimistic thing is that another interesting thing that is happening is that many people are rewriting the Haggadah, or rewriting the book that I said that we read out in the Seder. And so they're adding prayers and texts that are very much connected to health and to the pandemic. And this isn't the first time that this has happened in the Jewish world. So this has happened, we've seen it happen in the First World War and in obviously during the Holocaust. And but I think what this is showing us is that this teaches us maybe how seriously the virus is affecting us as human beings, because we see that in times of great disturbance, people suddenly change the Haggadot and change their prayer books to adjust. And we're seeing that happen again. And I will say that in the past 50 years, the more conservative and reform sects of Judaism, the Masorti movement, have re-edited the Haggadah with feminism and LGBTQ plus prayers and songs. But now I think we're seeing something really across the board. And I'm sure that many scholars in the future will be using this and making maybe new studies. So with the last minute that I have, I just want to share what I think the opportunity is here. So first of all, the core fabric of the Seder is different. We don't have the children at the center. And I think that maybe we can brand this as the year of the individual, where we all can create our own Seder and put our own meaning into the Haggadah, into something that usually, kind of gets taken away by the children. And so since I will be spending tomorrow evening alone with my husband, we're going to be trying to personalize these texts to our religious journey and to things that are meaningful to us. And I think what will be interesting to see in the future is, will this permeate then to, Passover 2021? Are we going to see a difference in the way that people view the Seder and view Passover because they've had this experience where they had to personalize the Seder and they had to run the show all alone? There wasn't anybody there with them. So in a sense, and I'll finish with this, I think that we're also going to see here an entrance of like a postmodern individualism into one of the most strict festivals of the Jewish religion. And it'll be really interesting to see if this has a lasting effect, both maybe on Passover next year, but also in general in the way that Jews celebrate festivals in the future. So that's just a little bit from me. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Alissa. And I'm handing over to Devin McLachlan.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. So for Christians, we're also entering into the holiest time of year for us. Although Christmas gets the bigger press, it's Holy Week that's really at the core of the Christian message. And the timing is not coincidental with Judaism, that this is a week that's tied in to Passover and to the Jewish roots of Christianity and who Jesus was. So it begins this past Sunday with Palm Sunday, with Jesus's triumphant entrance into Jerusalem in ironic mocking of the Roman governor's entrance through the other gate. Then on Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper, which is also the first communion, the first Eucharist, the first Mass, that special meal that Christians have of bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. The next day is Good Friday, Jesus's execution at the hands of the Roman authorities, his crucifixion, his death and burial. Holy Saturday, which is the day when churches were traditionally closed and no services are held on Holy Saturday until sundown. It's the day of the heralding of hell. It's a day of mystery when Christ is understood to have died, and before the resurrection that we celebrate on Easter Sunday, maybe with the dawn vigil or with the big celebratory Sunday morning service with choirs and organs and people in hats and Easter egg hunts afterwards. It's a core time. It's that message where we play out in drama, in liturgy, in passion readings, in music, in sermons, and in all sorts of ways, that story of the trial, execution, burial, and resurrection of Christ that's at the heart of the Christian message. Now, closure of buildings came a little early to the Church of England during this crisis. We began closing our buildings quite quickly, especially where I am at Great St. Mary's at the University Church, where we usually have 300,000 visitors a year. And now, although the government allows clergy to broadcast alone from their places of worship, the Church of England's forbidden its clergy from doing so. So instead, we're live streaming services from our homes. We're discovering the perils of Facebook filters and Zoom bombing. We'll host about 20 services this week at the University Church. And I'm empathizing with Tara here because I've ended up being the person on staff answering phone calls from the rest of the congregation about how to set up Zoom meetings and desperate panic calls from my other clergy colleagues while they're live streaming. So there are two kinds of service in Anglicanism. There are the offices, morning and evening prayer, that can be said privately by any Christian and that come out of an older monastic tradition, those daily prayers. And then there are the services of Holy Communion, which require a clergy person, a priest or a bishop. The offices are easy. They can be live streamed, they can be broadcast on the radio, families and individuals can say them on their own, but communion is trickier because of the requirement in the Church of England and in a lot of other traditional Western and Eastern churches to have an ordained minister. The difficulty is that the canons, the law of the Church of England, describes as a duty that all those who've been confirmed need to receive communion regularly. In years past, that might have been quite infrequently. Often these days, it's weekly or monthly or even daily, but specifically to receive communion at Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost. So what to do about Easter? In the Church of England, we're turning back to a practice of spiritual communion. It's one of these panic moments where you start looking in the junk drawer of the kitchen cabinet and you find the tool you desperately need that you've forgotten about. It's historically described in our Book of Common Prayer to describe the means of grace by which a person prevented for some serious reason from celebrating in a celebration of the Eucharist can, through prayer and intention, share in the communion. That, as the rubrics put it, we may truly eat and drink the body and blood of our Savior Christ, although we can't receive the sacrament physically. So no computer screens required for spiritual communion. It's a practice that developed centuries ago, in part out of our medieval experiences of plagues. So at my church on Easter, we'll be having a communion service on Facebook Live from the vicarage, and we'll be inviting those who watch to take part in spiritual communion. But we're also trying to figure out, how do we get people to sing the hymns that they love? How do you get all of those pieces that all together make Easter feel special? And we're watching out for kinds of dangers as well. One worry in the broader church is that people will take wine and bread and put them in front of their computer screen. But communion isn't about making magic bread. It's about sharing together in a common meal, either physically or in our hearts, a communion-making community by an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. If that's Scylla Charybdis, is the fear of clergy acting on behalf of others instead of as part of a shared body of Christ. There needs to be some public aspect of communion. You can't celebrate the Eucharist in Reformed churches on your own, although there's now permission to do so. Oh, goodness, I am rambling. I'm going to skip through here and just say, what are other churches doing? I have friends running an outdoor church for the homeless who are carrying on. This is in the States, but keeping distance. Roman Catholic churches have been broadcasting, and many have seen the image of the Pope in Rome at a distance. And there's a long tradition in Roman Catholicism about the efficacy of witnessing the Eucharist. There are Orthodox churches that are insisting that the virus can't be transmitted because it's the blood of Christ and will, in other places, carry on. And evangelical and especially Pentecostal churches that are gathering anyway, because one of the central aspects of Jesus's ministry was healing. And in the early church, the handling of poisonous vipers. So for some, continuing to meet is bravery, while for others, it looks like spiritual pride, that the danger be borne by the most vulnerable, and the viral load by the worshipers might bring home. It is, as we've been asked to look at, a chance for new spiritual discoveries, escaping the idolatry of building, which particularly infects the Church of England in many ways. We have beautiful buildings, beautiful liturgies, and that's not actually what we're worshiping, as spiritually nurturing as those can be, and instead rediscovering daily individual Christian practices of distinguishing between solitude and loneliness, and the geography of the communion of saints that transcends both space and time, and of discovering that love of neighbor is not exclusive to Christianity. Cooperating with other faiths is going to be vital as our collective response. I know St. Philip's is working with the new Cambridge Eco Mosque and others to support shut-ins in South Cambridge. Parishes are running food banks. They're working alongside secular authorities and other religious groups to organize volunteers, so that moving from being a building to being a real presence and engagement in our diverse communities might be what the church needs to do, not just now during this pandemic, but looking to the future as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Devin. And I'll hand over to our last speaker, Mohammed Ahmed.
Thank you. Hello all. So Ramadan is coming upon us very, very soon. About 23rd of April, it is going to begin. And Ramadan is the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. It's a month that is characterized by fasting during the day, which is done from sunrise until sunset, which most people seem to be very aware of. However, it's also characterized by its deep connection with the Quran. Fasting is something in itself that's ordained not only upon Muslims, of course, but the Quran says that it was also ordained to those before you, talking about the origins of fasting and how it has similar roots with Judaism and Christianity, of course. But also, Ramadan is a very important time for the Quran. It's also the time of the year in which the Quran was revealed. So we have the daytime fasting that occurs, of course, during the day, but at night we have recitation of congregational prayer, which is a very important part of Ramadan, which occurs in the mosques where the Imam essentially leads, and the Quran is, an entire portion of the Quran is recited by heart with all the congregation behind, following. Unfortunately, of course, due to the current circumstance, this night prayer will not be occurring in the mosque in a congregational fashion. Of course, this can be done, at home, and it's a chance for families to perform that congregational prayer together. And of course, with modern technology, you're never too far away from viewing that, those modern prayers happening in different places. And if they're, not to occur in certain mosques and, big environments, then of course that you always view the prayers from previous years, especially from Mecca or Medina. It's also a great opportunity for people to get together within families and break their fasts together. Many Muslims go to the mosque and break their fasts, in the mosque, and there's the men eat together and the women eat together, and there is a separation. And so families occasionally cannot sit together and eat together and enjoy the fast together, and that moment, the very important moment of breaking the fast and what that means, and that moment of prayer together. So it's a very important time for families also to then get together. In this modern world, I think many families hardly eat together, speak together, and sit together these days. So I think it would be an excellent opportunity this year, for people to enjoy that together and to be able to reflect together in a familial context. I would also just like to mention, because the Hajj is also coming up, which is an extremely important part of the Islamic festival, equivalent to Ramadan in terms of importance, and there is a possibility that it could be cancelled this year. Everything seems to be a little bit in the air, of course. But this isn't without historical precedence. I'd just like to reassure viewers. In 930 AD, there was an attack in Mecca, which resulted in 10 years of no pilgrimage. And it really helped scholars and Muslim community to kind of think about the insular, think about two very important concepts in Islam, and especially at the times of Hajj and Ramadan, called tafakkur and tadabbur, which is self-reflection and deep pondering on ourselves. So whether we are isolating within families or if we are alone, we can still continue that kind of deep self-reflection, thinking about ourselves, thinking about spirituality and how it is affecting us, and how our connection with God is. And that is something that doesn't stop. And I'd just like to finish on two very important Islamic pieces of advice. The first is Bunu masajid fi buyutikum. It's a very important piece of advice that's attributed to the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, which says that it's create mosques in your own home. And it's something that I think a lot of people tend to not necessarily understand. People think, okay, a mosque or a shrine is, has to be, separate from the house. It's a specific place where people gather, but also we should think about, having that connection within our own homes. And also, innal ard wasi'a, that the actual earth that God has given to humankind is a wide expanse. Wherever you find yourself to be, that's where you should pray. And that's the advice that we're given in Islam. And I think it's particularly pertinent with Ramadan coming up, with the fasting and the recitation of the Quran, and also, of course, with the Hajj. And that's what.
You caught me a bit by surprise. I was still muted because I hadn't realized that you were 2 minutes early. It's a very, very well-trained MPhil student of the Woolf Institute early. So we now are opening up for questions, and while you type away, I think I'll ask the first question before we see something come up. And this is directed at Alissa and Devin, because it plays less of a role in Islam. Devin, you mentioned the singing of hymns. Does it actually work? I mean, in your experience, has it worked singing together through Zoom or through other media, or does it not work because of the technical problems? Devin, you're mute.
Ironic given the question. For us, we found that the delay in Zoom is hard, although some choirs have been doing that. We've been having members of the congregation or a musical record hymns, and then we post and share those, and we'll encourage people to sing along with them. It's horrifyingly embarrassing even when you're in your own home, but it's wonderful to do. And I think a music like chant and recitation reaches a part of the heart and the mind that the spoken word can't get to. So we're trying to find ways. Our organist had recorded a lot of music, and he's been sharing that as each liturgical day, each holy day comes along, sharing a particular piece for people to listen to.
Okay.
But I do
Alissa?
know that some choirs, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What you want?
Has there been any singing, attempts at singing?
Yeah, so we hosted one, we hosted actually a few Kabbalat Shabbat on Zoom, and it came out completely hysterical because everybody was singing at the same time and you couldn't hear. And I think just in general, it wasn't a good, we got to the conclusion that in order to have like a congregational prayer together, everybody has to be on mute and one person leads. But there was a lot of laughing and a lot of kind of, what is this awkward thing? And it's going to take some time adjusting to. But I think we're on the path.
All right. We have a question from Netta Schramm. And in brief, what is the main challenge and the main opportunity you all feel coronavirus brings to your holidays? So basically one challenge and one opportunity for each of you. I'll start with Alissa.
So I think that I kind of already answered that question, but I'll just say, I'll answer it personally. I think that for me, the biggest challenge right now is how to create, at least tomorrow night, the Seder night, make it different from a regular Friday night for me and my husband, meaning not just having a nice meal together, but how do we actually put content in? And I think the opportunity is to maybe reflect about how do I personally connect to Passover, which is something I haven't really had to do before, even though I'm already, 28 years in this faith and I'm very observant. Just finding a new way to connect and personalize it for myself.
All right, thank you, Alissa. Devin.
Another opportunity and challenge that I hadn't touched on that are the same thing, which is for Anglicans, lex orandi, lex credendi, our praying shapes our believing. We're having to shape very new forms of prayer, and that's bringing up some old and some new questions about the nature of priesthood, about the nature of congregations, and the nature of being physically present. And so it's an opportunity to re-examine those, but we're in the danger of lex orandi, lex credenza. What we do in our living room shapes our new creed. And I think it is going to be a struggle after this is done to look at what we're really saying about what we mean by congregational prayer and what we mean by the sacraments.
Oh, thank you, Devin. Mohammed.
I would say the main challenge, similar to what I said before, is the lack of the congregational prayer and the people, the community getting together and enjoying Ramadan together. But then again, the main benefit then, of course, is that people can then focus on the individual, and they can focus on the familial, and they can focus on how to better themselves. And sometimes redirecting, the gaze back to oneself isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think it will help us in connecting our spirituality as well.
Thank you, Mohammed. I have another question from Hamza Nasir. What do Muslims do if they do not know the Quran for the night prayer?
Yeah, so essentially the way that the night prayer occurs in the mosque is the Imam knows the Quran by heart. This is recited. So what do you do if you're at home and you don't know the Quran by heart? There is a juristic leniency that you can hold a Quran in this specific circumstance and recite from the Quran. It's an old medieval opinion from the Maliki school of thought, which is one of the major schools of thought. But then in the modern circumstance, in periods of facing problematic periods like we do now, you're allowed to follow another school of thought, and so one can hold the Quran and pray the same night prayer that one would experience in the mosque. Right.
Thank you, Mohammed. Scott Spivey asked, he lives in the US and he has a medical background, and he thanks us all for our input, by the way. There have been faith groups who continue to congregate despite recommendations to respect social distancing. How do we talk to these groups, especially when faith leaders are encouraging people to keep showing up? Who would like to take this? And?
I could start.
Okay, Mohammed.
I'd just like to mention that what the Quran says about life and death, that someone who is responsible for killing someone or taking somebody's life, it's as if they've killed all of humankind. And if somebody has saved a single life, it's as if they've saved all of humankind. And I think there's a very important lesson in that humanity, it overtakes any sort of ritualistic principles that we might interpret, upon ourselves, or that are given to us in any sort of revelation. We have to first think about ourselves and think about our fellow human beings before we think about any sort of rituals or practices that may harm people.
Yeah, I can just continue from what Mohammed said. This is a really big problem right now in the Jewish community, specifically with the ultra-Orthodox. We're seeing, unfortunately, levels of disobedience that are very high, both in America and in the UK and here in Israel. And it's been like a really, really vibrant conversation. What I can say that we're doing as faith leaders ourselves is we're trying to create a dialogue and to create pressure towards those leaders and take responsibility for our faith community and say, really, this is endangering human lives, as Mohammed said. I really connect to what you shared. And the first and most important thing in the Jewish faith is to keep people's lives. So even though what we automatically do as believers and as faithful observants is to pray to God together to kind of relieve us of this crisis, what we are trying to direct these rabbis to realize is that they are actually hurting human beings. And so this is very much something that we're trying to create dialogue. But it is very hard, and I'm sharing the question. It's very disappointing to see these.
Yeah. Speaking as an American Christian, yeah, I was really glad someone else jumped in because it's infuriating and disappointing. I think I'd build on that for Christians. There's this wonderful moment in Matthew where Jesus says, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the congregation and on the street corners to be seen by others. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. There's a lovely precedent right there. But I think we're dealing with fear. And when people are afraid, sometimes they react in the most unhelpful ways. That's just the fingers in the ear, and we're going to do this. And it's all about showing our faith by doing something dangerous and foolhardy. It's immensely frustrating. And I think for Christians, there are particular aspects with things from like the Book of Acts, with the handling of venomous snakes, which happened as a natural incident. But liturgically, in some traditions, in American churches, from a charismatic tradition, it's intentionally picking up venomous snakes and passing them around in the congregation to show your faithfulness. So doing something dangerous in the faith of disease is a way to show that you have a gift of the Holy Spirit. I don't think that was the Christian intention, but it can be challenging to have that conversation in a way that invites dialogue and change rather than finger waving and why other Christians are wrong and I'm right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Devin. I have a question for Alissa from Safed Haji Mohammedovich. The Passover Seder often marks the absence of Prophet Elijah with an empty chair, an additional glass of wine and an open door. Could this tradition be useful to rethink the absence of others who would usually occupy the Seder table?
I think that is a lovely question. And I have seen a few Facebook posts about just specifically this comment. that this year, the symbolism of the empty chair and of the extra cup that is for the Prophet Elijah, for Eliyahu Navi, will also symbolize the people that we would like to have with us in our Seder. And this is definitely something that some Jews are adopting this year in light of the pandemic. So yeah, but it's a good idea, and it's great that he's tapped into that.
Okay, a question from Mark Umpleby. During Easter and Ramadan, we would attend each other's prayers and iftars, and I've been involved in organizing an annual Badly iftar that started in Joe Cox's memory, where 600 to 800 attend each year. What ideas and suggestions do you have of ways in this lockdown period for leaders, people of different faiths and none, can come together and support each other to keep up good relationships and grow new ones?
If I could start with this one, I think the current situation doesn't necessarily mean that we can't share the same experience. In Islam, fasting is considered the most meritorious act, because when you fast, nobody knows that you're fasting. If they look at you, they don't know that you're actually observing that worship, but you are observing that worship. And I think so. For example, you know, if somebody wants to experience Ramadan, they can always fast. And you know, you don't have to be in the same share the same physical space to then enjoy that same practice. And I think you know, again, with technology, with Zoom calling, you know, we can break the fast together and still kind of virtually. And I think that that's something that we can do this year.
Absolutely, those kinds of conversations, the relationships that have. One of the pieces I'm finding in the little bit of interfaith work I do is it's all the pre-existing relationships that are so key. It's a reminder of why we need to do that engagement work before these kind of crises happen, so that you do have people you call up to try to encourage just one-on-one buddy systems through Zoom if you've got those networks already. What are the small groups where people can break fast together at the end of the day? And then how can we celebrate the reopening of one another's spaces when all of this is over? Would be another wonderful opportunity.
All right.
Yeah.
Alissa, do you want to say something as well?
No, I just wanted to say that I share the same sentiment.
Yes, very good. We have two questions which sort of relate to each other. First, Lorna Edwell asks, could you explain how Easter and Passover relate to one another? And the other question is a bit longer, by Rick Sofa. Passover, Easter, and Ramadan occur on the same lunar this year. Would Alissa or Devin or Mohammed like to mention any links between them? I have in mind the hadith of Prophet Mohammed instituting Ashura to commemorate Passover. Devin mentioned Jesus and the Seder, and on a practical level, Christians and Muslims don't forbid electricity. There's no Zoom issue. Who introduced that Muslims had to recite the Quran by heart? So there are sort of a number of questions. Would any of you like to start?
I can start with the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad instituting Ashura to commemorate the Passover. I think that's quite an important thing. In Islam, fasting is always, whether it's Ramadan or any time of fasting, it's always linked with the previous religions and the fasting that had been instituted with the Christians and Jews. Because obviously Islam views Christianity and Judaism as God-given religions also. And that's a very key point. So when the story essentially is that when the Prophet Muhammad went to Medina, the people, the Jewish people were fasting, and the Prophet Muhammad said, "Nahnu ahaqqu bi Musa minhum," like we have just as much love and devotion towards Moses as you do. So we are also going to observe the fast. And every year, Muslims observe the fast. It's called Ashura, which means the 10th day, and that's fast. That's also the 10th day of Muharram, which was the same day in which they encountered the Jews of Medina fasting. And so it's a very important story, but also it shows that Islam and Muslims and everyone really should be willing to engage with those who are around them. Where they see that people are doing something through the goodness of their hearts, they also should engage with those people and engage with those practices.
For Christians, originally, Easter was the Sunday after the 15th of Nisan, after the beginning of Passover. After Nicaea, we began our own calculations, and there's a cultural shift there to a more solar Roman calendar. So it's the the Sunday after the first full moon after the 21st of March, the vernal equinox, which falls near Passover. And it's part of that long verse between Christianity and Judaism as well. But it's also not simply that was the chronological time that the events of Good Friday and Easter occurred, but it's also that tie with the story that Christians celebrate as well, of liberation and liberation from death and from slavery, and an unexpected discovery of freedom and God's providence working in a very unexpected and dramatic way. So the stories of Passover feed into the story of Easter for Christians. At the same time, Church of England and other churches are trying to be very careful that we're not culturally appropriating seders when we do Maundy Thursday agapes or meals. We're trying to respect both that distance and that common heritage.
Yeah, I think for Jews, at least this is a bit a different, like it's different because Jews believe that they were the religion that kind of came first, right? And so the Passover comes first. But I will say that something interesting that I've seen in Israel in the past month is now that really, you know, the Palestinians and the Arabs of Israel are preparing for Ramadan, and the Christians here are celebrating Easter. There is a sense in the current climate of the pandemic that we're all trying to help each other. And there's been a few really touching, I'd say, kind of interfaith engagements here in the past even week or two. So the people of Tira, a city like an Arab city here in Israel, are helping Bnei Brak prepare for Passover, and then people are starting to say, oh, how are we going to be, you know, assisting them towards Ramadan? And I think that this is something that we haven't really seen before when the faiths have shared the closeness of the different festivals in the same month. So this has happened before, that Ramadan was near, you know, Pentecost or near Sukkot or other Jewish festivals. And I think actually this year the crisis is enabling interfaith work that we just haven't seen before. And I at least have found it extremely touching. So that's just something that I've seen in the past month.
All right, thank you. We have a few more questions. I'm trying to sort of sum up some of the questions because we have too many questions to be answered. So I'm sort of combining two questions. Michael McFarland Campbell has said, is the coronavirus situation actually helping to build communities who only usually see each other on the Sabbath days? And Sandra Littner's asking, do the participants lists you receive from Zoom give you an idea of who is joining in with your online services? Are you seeing new people as well as regular community members? Perhaps Devin and Alissa, who are actually sort of managing Zoom lists, you could answer that?
For us, we've been doing our services largely on Facebook Live, and some of that was generational, people who have Facebook accounts, but not necessarily Twitter, and that they can watch without signing up for Facebook. If you're live streaming through a page rather than as an individual, the public can watch just by putting in the URL without having a Facebook account. We do coffee hour and meetings and Bible studies by Zoom. I do have friends in the States who've been Zoom bombed in their worship, sometimes in some pretty awful ways. LGBT clergy that I know who've had really horrible homophobic and racist attacks from unexpected Zoom attendees. I think in the last week, a lot of people have learned more about using waiting rooms, using passwords, keeping an eye out. But I do know on Facebook Live, we're seeing a lot of people that don't live locally, that might be on a different time zone, have just stumbled onto us. And I'm curious what follows up after that, how we care for them or how we help them afterwards connect to their local communities, while also continuing to feed them through our online presence. Alissa?
Yeah, so for us, I'd say that we've been seeing I'd say even new prayers assemble on, like, not even in our private Zoom, but like on Facebook. Suddenly people that aren't haven't identified as observant at all are hosting family prayers before Shabbat, and they're broadcasting on Facebook. And I think that maybe the fact that we're lonely is also kind of opening up this new kind of spirituality that I've been seeing. So that's just been interesting for me to kind of peer at as an observer, not as a participant. In our own personal Zoom community, then I haven't seen many new faces. But I will say that, like Devin, unfortunately, the Jewish community has experienced some anti-Semitic attacks when they are having Zoom prayers. So people are joining and kind of taking over and doing things that are a little bit disturbing. But all in all, I'm very happy at the things that we are seeing, and the new, I think really the new communities that are forming in these virtual spaces, people that are becoming spiritual that we haven't seen them act in this way before. So that's been something very, very just beautiful to see.
All right, thank you, Alissa. We are sort of slightly over time, Alissa. Can we still have one more question, or?
Yeah, we can have one more.
Okay, so we have one last question. I really apologize to everyone whose questions we couldn't ask in the end because we're running out of time. But I asked one more thing. So what would you like to see once this is all over and we're back in church buildings, synagogues, mosques? Will we sort of back to what we've always known with additional online support, or will there be a real rethink of what a gathered congregation or community or parish is?
I'll start, and I'll also use this as a segue for our next webinar series, which is happening on Tuesday. And I'll say that something that is very apparent is that, and we'll talk about this next week more, is that on Zoom, when we pray together, everybody is equal. Everybody has their little square. And you really can't see who's like the director of the congregation, who's the rabbi. We're all here together in this room. And so what I'm hoping to keep from this experience, from these virtual communities that are forming, is the equality, and maybe even the rethinking of, the gender roles, women, men, and just maybe rethinking how each of us accesses our faith, personalizes, right? What I spoke about regarding Passover has a personal access to the holiday, but also a personal access to the community and to spirituality. So I'm really hoping we can keep that. And I think that the pandemic is definitely, kind of making us self-isolated. So maybe also finding a new path to our religions. And we'll talk more about what happens when you pray on Zoom and what happens to gender balances next week.
I expect we're going to find, I think absolutely, I think we're all going to be finding that some new and interesting communities and roles. I think the hunger is going to be important as well. These first few weeks, we've got a lot of pastoral role just to try to help hold on to the familiar. But as this stretches on and we end in those periods of grief and frustration and absence, I think seeing what we're hungry for when it's missing and learning how to treasure that when we return, and rediscovering things that we valued in our faith communities and in our spaces and in our congregations, and people that we know, that I hope we remember what we had missed during this time, and that we treasure and honor it when we return to normal, whatever normal is going to look like afterwards.
I think very, very similar to what Devin just said. As many of you will know, the Great Mosque in Mecca is mostly closed, and you can see the pictures of the wide expanse completely empty, which it never has been, for forever essentially. And it's very, very interesting and very striking to see so many people be affected by that, and then to watch videos and from when it was busy and when people are praying together, and to feel that connection with, in this case, Islam's holiest site, but which is a mosque essentially, and it just reminds me of an Islamic saying that al-mu'min fil masjid kas-samak fil ma', which is that the believer in the place of worship is like a fish in the water. When they're out of water, they don't feel right at all, and they spiritually die. and that people will have this hunger and have this yearning to return back to their places of worship. And I think it would be brilliant to see.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. Again, I apologize that we could not answer all questions, and there are more questions relating to funerals, relating to ethical questions, relating to various other topics. But I hope that you all come back to our seminar next week, and we can actually then still ask these questions then. Again, a big applause, I suppose, to our panelists. Thank you also all for being such a good audience, and for your interesting questions, for your plentiful questions. And I really do hope that we all see each other again next Tuesday, 14th of April at 11 a.m., where we will discuss how the three Abrahamic faiths are responding to the disconnect from their core places of worship. And I hope that some of the questions you've had now can also then be answered next week. So I draw this wonderful webinar to a close, and I wish you all a healthy and happy rest of the week and wonderful holidays for Passover and for Easter.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.